Welcome everyone to this evening's webinar on data centres and energy demand. My name is Maeve and I will be your host for this evening. In the simplest terms, data centres, the ones we will be speaking about today, they're described sometimes as server farms. So they're big buildings which hold huge numbers of servers, which in turn provide the cloud storage that most of us use every day. What has this got to do with fossil fuels? So our electricity demands are increasing all of the time, and Eirgrid estimates that data centres will account for 3/4 of all the increases in our electricity demand between now and 2030. The way we make electricity in Ireland is through a mixture of fossil fuels and renewables, but the vast majority does come from fossil fuels. And as our demand increases, our supply will have to increase as well. And the increased demand caused by data centres will cost us about €9 billion by 2027, and add about 1.5 million tonnes to our carbon emissions by 2030. Can we build data centres and achieve our climate targets?
There's two main points I want to make. The first is about the need to maybe think about data centres not in isolation, but to think about data centers as part of a wider network of telecommunications and energy infrastructures that are being built out, that are in place, that have a kind of a material form, whether that's wind turbines or whether that's fiber optic cables or whether that's liquefied natural gas terminals even. The other example I think that is specific to Ireland is recently the Meanbog peat slide, which happened in November of last year. That was a wind farm that had been connected to Amazon Web Services. They had entered into a contract with it, and there had been huge fanfare when Amazon entered into that agreement. The government lauded it for its green commitments. But then when the landslide happened, because that wind farm shouldn't have been built on a bog, and the communities up there in Donegal said it shouldn't, and experts said it shouldn't, Amazon were nowhere to be seen, and the government was nowhere to be seen. So the impact of big tech are not so, they are far away, but they're also closer to home. So that's the first point. There is this kind of idea that data now is like water. You hear this argument, data is sort of like oxygen. It's something that we need. It's necessary to our lives. And again, I think it's important, maybe, even though it seems a bit kind of fantastical, to think about how we need to push back against that. And not push back against it by thinking about something like digital sobriety, which is a term that has come up. This idea that it's individual responsibility to not be on their phones, to not be on Netflix. It's a bit like individualizing responsibility for climate change or plastics. Now, I think it's important to think about the drivers of this expansion in data. And there's two things I'm briefly going to mention. One is streaming, and it was around the Tiger King. I don't know if any of you saw it, this series on Netflix back in the first lockdown. And she showed that in March in the United States, the streaming of Tiger King over that 1 month in the United States equaled the energy use of Rwanda in 2016. But what's driving it? And again, it's important to target the drivers as being Netflix, being these platforms, being big tech that wants us to consume more. But it's the same if we think how campaigns have been built around fast fashion. We've been quick to recognize that these fast fashion companies are about driving throwaway clothes, about driving a kind of a type of obsolescence that you have to buy new clothes the next season, that it's very cheap. It's the same kind of business model that these streaming platforms happen. And that's something that we should address, or at least talk about. The third thing is to think about degrowth, which is a concept maybe some of you are familiar with, which is about downscaling the throughput of resources and energy in our economies, to think about what degrowth means in relation to the digital economy, and what a future might look like without this massive sort of production and circulation of data, which is not sustainable.
Just so we get an idea of what the problem is. So data centers on a global platform have been growing about 10% per year. In places like Dublin, and we're not talking about Ireland, we're talking about Dublin. Places like Dublin, the growth has been much greater because Dublin's a very attractive place to build a data center. And it's been made more attractive by the government and their deliberate actions on low corporation tax, for example, and wanting high-tech jobs. In the pandemic, the growth went up by 15 to 20%, depends on where you were. Data traffic rose almost instantly on the day. March last year, 20%, bang, straight up, because the type of data centers that are in Ireland draw their high power almost constantly because they're not serving Ireland, they're serving all of Europe, Middle East and Africa. Dublin is heading towards 800 megawatts to maybe even 1,000 megawatts, a gigawatt in the next 5 years. Maybe you're reaching 25 to 30% of the grid. Now that would probably be a world record. The problem is that all of those data centers that you've got there want to be renewably powered. What happens when the wind doesn't blow? You must burn gas and coal. And the data centers will sign virtual power purchase agreements. They will all be 100% renewably powered. They will tell everybody who they are, but the Irish grid will have to meet the demand with fossil fuels because they'll be buying that power outside of Ireland, even in grids that aren't connected, even tortuously, to Ireland. The point is they will enable the wind capacity but consume it, and they will claim to be 100% renewable quite legally. Google does it already in Oregon. They 100% renewably powered by Texas wind, and the Texas grid isn't even connected to Oregon. So it's a form of offsetting, which is buying your power somewhere else.
So a question from Garrett is, could we demand that a data centre can only be built if it has its own renewable supply from local wind, solar and storage, so no electricity is needed from the Irish grid?
Yes, you can, but they will be a hell of a lot smaller. You know, the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, and the storage, people talk about storage as important for renewables. It is at a very small local level, but for a grid, you've got a grid of 4 gigawatts demand. The storage would be the size of Dublin to give you 1 week's storage. And there are times when the sun doesn't shine enough and the wind doesn't blow enough that you will need backup power.
I wanted to get kind of into the nitty gritty of how data centers go from, just plans to actually being built. So looking at the planning process in particular, because that's also a very concrete place where the public can get involved. This is where they've assessed the potential of the development of the data center to impact Ireland's annual emissions, 0.54% potential impact on emissions every year. So it seems like a small number, and they certainly think it's a small number. So, because they say here, the impact to climate as a result of the proposal will be negative long-term and imperceptible. But given that there are around 100 data centers either built or at various places in the planning process right now, that number adds up really, really quickly. Another thing to watch out for is, you can see it in the development description here, on-site fossil fuel power generation. Because there's so much data center demand, particularly in the Dublin area, and they're getting planning permissions left and right, there's really big grid capacity issues. And in response to that, Eirgrid has actually introduced a policy in their grid connection offer process that in areas of grid constraint like Dublin, the data centers have to have on-site power generation capacity. And this is really turning out to be gas-fired. So not only do we have the data center energy demand on the grid, but then you're increasing lock-in to fossil fuels because they're also then applying for fossil fuel generation capacity on site. It's really clear that the current model of granting planning permission kind of in an unfettered way for data centers is not going to work long term if we're going to address the enormity of the climate crisis.